Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are wrestling with, I think, one of the most fundamental questions that defines us. How did we stop being perpetual chasers of food and, well, become its architects?
It's a huge question. We're talking about the single greatest transformation in human history.
Absolutely. The shift from hunting and gathering to actually producing our own food.
And it's so easy to just say that in a sentence, but the reality is this was a massive gradual revolution. I mean, it took millennia to unfold.
And it changed everything.
Everything. From our teeth and our bones to our social structures. It's what allowed us to build villages, store surpluses, specialize our labor, and then, eventually build the first cities.
So our mission today is to dive into a whole stack of sources that detail the dawn of this era, the Neolithic and Chalcolithic ages. We're focusing specifically on the Indian subcontinent in a period from roughly 7,000 to 2000 BCE.
Yeah, and we're really trying to track the when, the how, and maybe the most complex part, the why. Why did people in all these different regions independently decide to start domesticating plants and animals?
That word independently feels really key here.
It's vital. The sources really emphasize that this wasn't, a single switch thrown by one brilliant inventor somewhere. It was a gradual, multi-centric process.
Happening in different places at different times.
Exactly. People were adapting to their local environments, to the indigenous species that were available. And what we see in South Asia is this incredibly complex cultural mosaic. It really shows regional ingenuity rather than, say, just receiving farming technology from somewhere else.
Okay, so let's unpack this monumental shift. I mean, we have tens of thousands of years of successful hunting and gathering. It worked. So for you listening, what's the precise archaeological line that separates a really sophisticated collector from a true domesticator?
The line is all about control. It's about intentional long-term interference. We can use grain as a pretty clear example to show that difference.
Okay, let's focus on that intentionality.
So imagine you're a Mesolithic community. You're walking through a field of wild barley, you harvest the ripe heads, you take them back, and you consume everything you collect. In that scenario, you're a food collector, a very efficient one maybe, but you're just exploiting a resource in its natural state.
Right.
Plant domestication, on the other hand, happens when you do that same harvest, you consume most of it, but you deliberately set aside a portion of those seeds to plant later.
So you're saving for a rainy day, but also for a sunny day when you can plant.
Exactly. And by choosing which seeds to store and replant, you're introducing selective pressure. You're favoring plants that have traits that are useful to you.
Which eventually changes the plant itself.
Precisely. It leads to morphological changes in the plant. So it's a shift from just managing a resource to actively, engineering its future.
And I assume the same logic applies to animals.
It does, though the process is a little different. Animal keeping is one thing. You might capture wild animals, keep them for a bit before you slaughter them.
Right.
But full animal domestication requires taking them out of the wild population, maintaining them, and this is the crucial part, breeding them under human control.
So you're selecting for specific traits.
Yes. Often things like docility, or maybe increased meat yield, or better milk production. This is selective breeding, and over time it creates a dependent new subspecies.
And this whole process of control and selection was happening, it seems, independently in multiple places around the globe. When we look at that period between, say, 8,000 and 6,000 BCE, our sources point to three key recognized centers of origin.
The first, and the one that's probably most referenced, is West Asia, the so-called Fertile Crescent.
Of course.
Sites like Jericho, Satal Hugh, they show the early domestication of staple cereals like wheat and barley, and also the key herd animals, sheep and goats. That really became the foundation for Western civilization.
Okay, that's center one. What's number two?
Next, you have Southeast Asia. The finds at a place called Spirit Cave in Thailand are really crucial. They found evidence of intensive collection, maybe even outright cultivation, of about 10 different plant species.
Wow, 10. Like what?
Things like betel nut, almond, cucumber. It suggested that the local populations were already engaged in these really highly developed food management strategies that were, pointing straight towards domestication.
And the third major center is South Asia itself.
Yes, specifically Baluchistan, centered on the incredible site of Mehrgarh. The evidence there is just so powerful. We find early domestic varieties of both barley and wheat right alongside the domestication of cattle, sheep, and goats.
And crucially, the wild ancestors of the barley were from that area.
That's the key. It proves it happened there on its own.
We should probably also acknowledge the other major centers that followed not long after? I mean, for you listening, this was truly a worldwide moment.
Oh, absolutely. In South China, you have sites like Hemidu showing early rice cultivation and the domestication of the water buffalo. Across the Pacific, by 5000 BCE, communities in Mexico were mastering corn, beans, squash, and domesticating turkeys.
And in South America.
The Peruvian highlands, they were cultivating potatoes, beans, gourds, and managing llamas and alpacas. Meanwhile, sub-Saharan Africa saw the independent rise of things like millets, sorghum, and yams.
So we have this massive, simultaneous global shift, which of course brings us back to the central mystery. Why? Why switch? After successfully finding food for maybe 95% of human history, why take on the burden of farming? I mean, it's often harder, more repetitive work.
It is. And the diet is less varied. It's a huge question. And the sources give us 4 major academic theories trying to explain that decision.
Okay, let's start with the first one.
The earliest really influential explanation came from V. Gordon Childe back in 1952. It's called the desiccation theory, or sometimes the oasis theory. Childe focused purely on environmental necessity.
Okay, so a do-or-die kind of situation. How did necessity force farming?
Childe argued that at the end of the Pleistocene, the global climate changed. Specifically, it led to significant desiccation, a lot of drying up in parts of West Asia and North Africa.
So water becomes scarce.
Exactly. And this environmental stress forces people, plants, and animals to concentrate in these limited refuges like river valleys or oases. And this enforced proximity, this interdependence, essentially forced humans to learn to manage and ultimately domesticate these resources. It was a survival mechanism.
It's a very compelling, straightforward environmental argument. But it was challenged pretty quickly, wasn't it?
It was. Robert J. Braidwood in 1960 found some pretty compelling counter-evidence. He pointed out that climate changes, even big ones, had happened repeatedly throughout the Pleistocene without ever sparking agriculture.
So if climate change was the only catalyst, farming should have started much, much earlier.
That was his point. So what was Braidwood's alternative? He proposed the nuclear zone theory. It shifted the focus from crisis to, well, opportunity and human ingenuity.
Okay, so not forced by the environment, but enabled by it.
Right. He argued that domestication happened in these nuclear zones, areas that were naturally rich in the wild ancestors of domesticable species. For Braidwood, it was the result of increasing human knowledge, of experimentation, of this accumulated experience with the local environment.
So in his view, agriculture was kind of an inevitable cultural outcome once you had the right plants and the right human curiosity in the same place.
Exactly. It was internally driven, not externally forced by climate.
This makes the early farmer sound a bit like an inquisitive scientist. But then, a few years later, Lewis Binford came along and argued that, stable, thriving populations just wouldn't choose this difficult path unless they were under some kind of external pressure again.
Binford's demographic stress theory from 1968 was a major, major intervention, and he had a point. Ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherers show they typically live well within the resource capacity of their environment.
They're not serving.
No, so something external has to come along and upset the equilibrium. Binford argued for demographic pressure, specifically external pressure.
And what was that specific external pressure he pointed to?
He argued that the rise in global sea levels at the end of the Pleistocene forced previously thriving coastal populations to migrate inland.
Ah, okay, so you have a sudden influx of new people.
Right. This influx of people into the traditional hunting grounds of inland groups upsets the existing people-to-food balance. And it forces the groups on the margins of those zones to invent or adopt new food strategies like farming just to survive the increased competition.
That paints a picture of forced migration and competition leading to innovation. What was the main weakness of Binford's model as later scholarship saw it?
The primary challenge is just a lack of archaeological evidence. We simply don't have definitive proof of this specific mass migration of coastal people inland right when farming started in the Near East.
The timing doesn't quite line up with the evidence on the ground.
Not perfectly. And it's also hard to argue for a real overpopulation crisis when these communities were still so incredibly small and the resources in those nuclear zones were generally pretty abundant.
Okay, so that's 3. And finally, we have Kent Flannery, who kind of turned the conversation on its head, right? He focused less on the why it started and more on the process of how it kept going.
Flannery's adaptive advantage model from 1969 is all about the positive feedback loop. He argued that human interference, in certain cases, actually increased the productivity of the resource, which then incentivized even more interference.
Okay, can you give us a concrete example of that positive feedback system?
The best one is maize. The wild ancestor of maize, a plant called teosinte, has this tiny, fragile cob with very few grains.
Not much of a meal.
Not at all. But when early people started transplanting teosinte from its natural home into new habitats, basically protecting it, encouraging it to grow, the plant responded to these selective pressures. It started to undergo genetic changes. Specifically, the cob got bigger.
And that ear stalk, the raichis, became tougher. We'll be hearing a lot about that.
We will.
Mm.
It developed a tough raches, holding more grains together. So once people realized that transplanting led to a genetically altered, much more productive food source, they were strongly incentivized to just commit fully to domestication. Flannery argues the process itself became its own reward.
So we've got environmental determinism, cultural readiness, demographic stress, and adaptive feedback. And I'm guessing the consensus from our sources is that no single theory explains this everywhere.
Not at all. It was likely a confluence of factors, a lot different in every region. But to really track this process, especially in the varied ecosystems of the Indian subcontinent, we need to know what archaeologists are actually looking for on the ground. How do they physically tell the difference between wild aurochs and domestic cattle?
Right. Since we can't actually observe the Neolithic farmers planting their crops, we have to rely on the scientific analysis of their trash, basically, and their skeletons. Let's start with the animals. Beyond just finding bones, what are the subtle physical signs that prove an animal was domesticated?
Well, we look for very specific morphological changes that happen under human selective pressure. Over thousands of years, animals that are managed and bred by humans tend to diverge physically from their wild cousins.
And what's the first thing you'd notice?
Generally, the early domesticates are often smaller than their wild counterparts. The wild aurochs, for instance, was absolutely massive.
A formidable beast.
Very. But when humans start managing them, maybe selectively breeding for docility or just for convenience of housing, the animals often shrink, at least initially. Later on, with better breeding and feeding, they might get bigger again, but that initial trend is usually a reduction in size.
That makes sense. Humans would prefer an easier, less aggressive animal to handle. What other changes show up in the bones?
We see noticeable differences in the skull and the teeth. The domestic animal's face tends to get shorter relative to its brain case. Their teeth, especially the molars and premolars, they often shrink. And sometimes certain teeth just disappear entirely as their diet changes.
In the horns.
A reduction in horn size and a change in shape is very common. Those are often traits for defense and aggression in the wild, which humans would actively select against.
What about animals used specifically for labor, like the early draft cattle? Can you see that in the bones?
Yes, you can. In the archaeological record, we can differentiate. In general, domesticates show weaker muscle ridges compared to their wild, high-endurance cousins. However, if an animal like cattle was selectively bred for pulling heavy loads, certain muscle ridges and joint facets would actually be strengthened and enlarged.
So the bones literally tell the story of their life's work.
They do, but these changes aren't instantaneous. The sources note, for example, that these morphological changes took thousands of years to fully manifest in the horse, but they were much faster in sheep, goats, and cattle.
Why the difference?
It's likely a combination of their shorter life cycles and just the intensity of early human management.
But the physical bones are only part of the story. How do archaeologists infer domestication when the bone structure is still ambiguous or in that transitional phase?
Inference really relies on context and statistical analysis. First, if you find a species way outside its natural geographic habitat, like finding the remains of mountain goats consistently on a desert plain where they wouldn't naturally live, that strongly suggests they were brought there and maintained by people.
And the most important statistical method involves herd management, right?
That's where faunal analysis really shines, through looking at age and sex ratios.
Mm-hmm.
In the wild, male-to-female ratios are typically 1-to-1, and the age profile is pretty balanced.
Okay.
But in a managed domestic herd, the ratios are dramatically skewed. The human goal is maximum profit, milk, meat, labor, wool. So young males are often slaughtered early for meat or castrated for labor.
While the females are kept for breeding.
Exactly. The females are kept until they're very old for sustained breeding and milk production. So if you find a bone assemblage where most of the remains belong to young males and old females, that's definitive proof of a human management strategy. It's a non-natural, deliberate pattern.
Okay, let's turn to plants. We mentioned the races earlier. Why is this tiny part of the plant such a definitive smoking gun for plant domestication?
The rachis is the tiny stalk that attaches the individual seed, or spikelet, to the main ear of the grain. In wild cereals, that rate cheese is fragile or brittle.
And that's a good thing for the wild plant.
It's a brilliant evolutionary adaptation for natural seed dispersal. When the grain ripens, the head just shatters easily, scattering seeds over a wide area.
But that's a nightmare for a human trying to harvest it.
Exactly. When humans harvest by cutting the grain heads, they inevitably select for those rare mutants whose rachies is tough and doesn't shatter, because those are the only ears that stay intact long enough to be brought back to the camp.
If those are the seeds you replant.
They quickly become the dominant variety. Domesticated wheat and barley have a tough rachies. They hold the ear together until a human threshes it. That change is undeniable evidence of human selective pressure.
But the sources also noted the challenge with root crops. Why are things like potatoes and yams so much harder to identify archaeologically?
Two main reasons. First, they just lack hard parts. They're soft tissues that rarely survive carbonization, unlike grains. And second, they often reproduce asexually, which means they don't necessarily undergo the same dramatic genetic and morphological changes you see in sexually reproducing grains.
So the difference between a wild yam and a domestic one is much harder to swap.
Yeah, much, much harder.
So how do archaeologists even recover these minuscule, carbonized plant remnants that prove domestication happened?
They rely on some really specialized techniques. The most efficient method for getting these macrobotanical remains is called the flotation technique.
How exactly does that work in the field? It sounds very delicate.
It is precise. You take a soil sample, often from a hearth or maybe a suspected storage pit, and you dry it. Then you slowly introduce this material into water.
Okay.
The heavy inorganic stuff dirt, stones, big pottery fragments sinks to the bottom. But the crucial part is that the organic material, especially if it's been carbonized, burnt into charcoal, which preserves it, is lighter and it floats to the surface.
And you should skim it off.
You skim it off carefully with a fine mesh sieve so you don't miss even the tiniest seed. Carbonization is really the key here because it preserves the structure, making it possible to identify and date.
That's brilliant. And beyond the large seeds, there are microbotanical remains too, right?
Yes, we go even deeper. We analyze things called phytoliths. These are tiny, very durable silica particles that are found inside the cells of plants. Different plant species produce distinctively shaped phytoliths.
So you can tell what was growing there even without the seeds.
You can. It allows us to differentiate between, say, different types of grasses, or even between wild and domesticated varieties in some cases.
And you can also use pollen for more general environmental reconstruction.
Absolutely. That's palynology, the study of pollen. Pollen grains have these incredibly tough outer shells that can survive in sediments for thousands of years. By analyzing layers of sediment, we can build up a pollen profile. A sudden shift from tree pollen to grass and weed pollen, for example, is strong evidence for massive forest clearance.
By humans to make way for farming.
That's usually the cause.
And finally, the really cutting-edge techniques.
Modern methods, especially in Western archaeology, include AMS dating accelerator mass spectrometry. This is huge because it lets us directly date individual tiny seeds, requiring just a fraction of the sample size of old-school C14 dating.
And DNA.
And DNA studies, which can definitively link domesticated plants back to their specific wild ancestors, helping us pinpoint the exact nuclear zones where domestication first happened.
Now that we have the toolkit, let's apply it. The first major evidence point in South Asia. Before the 1970s, many scholars just assumed that farming migrated into India from the Near East, and that whole notion was just radically altered by the findings at Mehrgarh.
Mehrgarh is the key aha moment for the subcontinent, no question. The excavations, which started in 1974, dramatically pushed back the timeline of settled life in South Asia. They revealed this sophisticated Neolithic culture beginning as early as the 8th millennium BCE.
Tell us about the location of this site. Why is it so strategic?
Mehrgarh is on the Kachi plain of Baluchistan, right next to the Bolan River. And the geography here is just so important. The Bolan Pass is a crucial mountain route that links the Indus Valley to Central Asia and the Iranian Plateau.
So the natural crossroads.
It's a perfect geographic nexus for early settlement and trade. And the area itself is naturally fertile. It's known as the breadbasket of Baluchistan, historically rich in both wild cereals and game.
Let's focus on period I, the earliest Neolithic phase, from the 8th to the 6th millennia BCE. What did these earliest settlements actually look like?
The early Megarians lived in surprisingly standardized, multi-celled houses made of handmade mud bricks. These bricks had these distinct rounded ends, and often you can see the finger impressions of the builders on their upper surfaces.
Wow.
And the houses were rectangular, divided into small, separate storage units. Crucially, some of these multi-celled structures, which were devoid of any domestic trash, are interpreted as communal granaries.
Proof of early storage and surplus management.
Exactly. It was central to their economy from the very beginning.
And they did all this initially without pottery. The sources note, period, I was a ceramic.
Correct. The lack of pottery is a significant marker of a very early Neolithic status, though simple handmade pieces do appear later in period IB, but their toolkit was highly specialized.
What did they have?
Thousands of microliths, tiny geometric stone tools. Many were carefully set into wooden or bone handles using bitumen as an adhesive. These were basically sickles for harvesting grain. They also had groundstone hand axes or celts and sophisticated bone tools like needles and awls.
Okay, now let's get to the really surprising part, the evidence of connectivity. We're talking about long-distance trade routes already operating in the 8th millennium BCE.
This is truly astonishing. It shows these early communities were not isolated at all. The graves from period I, where people were buried in a flexed position, often covered in red ochre, contained grave goods that signal these extensive networks.
What kind of imported items are we talking about?
Well, we found necklaces made of turquoise, which must have come from sources in eastern Iran or Central Asia, over 1,000 kilometers away.
Incredible.
There was lapis lazuli, a highly prized blue stone, which came from the Chagai Hills in Baluchistan, or more famously, from Badakhshan in Afghanistan. And we found marine shells, which had traveled a staggering 500 kilometers inland from the Makran coast.
So the ability of this early community to source and value these goods from so far away proves that the foundations of the Indus trade system were laid thousands of years before the first cities.
Absolutely.
Let's get to the heart of it, their diet, and the actual process of domestication at Mehrgar.
The transition is visible chronologically in the animal bones. In the lowest levels of period I, the diet is dominated by wild animals, gazelle, deer, nilgai, onager. But as you move up through the layers, the frequency of wild animal bones just drops dramatically.
And it's replaced by domesticates.
Yes, paralleled by a surge in the bones of domesticated cattle, goats, and sheep. By the end of period I, cattle were the single most important domesticated animal.
And the plant evidence tells us why Mehrgar is considered a true nuclear zone for domestication.
It's all about the barley. Barley was the most crucial early crop. And the remarkable thing is they found wild, transitional, and fully domesticated varieties of 6-row naked barley, all in the same sequence.
So that sequence proves conclusively that North Baluchistan was in the natural habitat of wild barley and that domestication happened in situ.
Right there, independently.
But the wheat tells a slightly different story, suggesting some early interaction with other centers.
That's right. They also grew domesticated wheat einkorn, emmer, and naked wheat from period onwards. However, archaeologists haven't found definitive evidence of the wild ancestors of these specific wheat strains locally.
So what does that suggest?
It suggests that while the Mehrgarians were highly skilled farmers, they may have acquired wild or transitional wheat varieties from the West Asian center and then finished the domestication process themselves, adapting it to their own local conditions. It shows both independent innovation and early diffusion.
And the cost of this commitment to cereals is even visible in their health.
Yes. The human remains from period 3 onwards show increasing evidence of dental deterioration, cavities, and even evidence of tooth probing, which suggests they were trying to relieve severe dental pain.
Which is a predictable biological marker of a high-carb diet.
A very common trade-off of the transition to farming.
Now, while Mehrgar is the primary example, the Northwest wasn't uniform. There were different approaches to early settlement, like at Kiligul Muhammad.
Kiligul Muhammad, or KGM, in the Quetta Valley is fascinating because it seems to represent a slightly different economic path. KGMI, around 5500 BCE, was a ceramic and showed clear evidence of domesticated animals, cattle, sheep, goat, but they found almost no evidence of cultivated cereals.
So they were pastoralists first.
It suggests that some communities in the region may have started out as semi-nomadic pastoralists, focusing on animal management before they committed to settled agriculture.
And then a site like Dam Sadat shows signs of later artistic development.
Right. Dam Sadat, around 3000 BCE, shows multi-roomed mud brick structures and the development of specialized ceramics, the Quetta-ware pottery, which is characterized by this buff color with intricate black painted geometric designs.
And it also yielded some of those early terracotta female figurines.
Yes, the ones sometimes generically called the Zob Mother Goddess, which indicates the evolving role of cultic imagery.
And finally, in this region, the vast Hakrowares culture.
This culture, concentrated in the Kholistan Desert, is identified by its coarse red or brown pottery with simple incised lines. The sites range hugely in size, from small seasonal camps to settlements of up to 30 hectares.
What's notable about them?
The reliance on mixed economies. At sites like Jalilpur, even with Neolithic tools and terracotta bull figurines, fishing was still crucial. You see that from the terracotta net sinkers they found. It just underscores that many early communities blended domestication with traditional hunting and gathering, creating a very flexible way of life.
The sheer diversity of adaptation across the subcontinent really does prove this wasn't a single wave, but a complex tapestry of localized invention. Let's look at how the shift unfolded outside of the Northwest.
Right, let's start in the Vincian fringes in southern Uttar Pradesh. This area provides really strong evidence for an early, independent center of rice domestication.
Which is crucial because it gives India its own claim to one of the world's most important staples.
Indeed. Wild rice was native to the Ganga and Vindhyan regions. And the Neolithic culture here seems to have grown directly out of a strong Mesolithic base. You see continuity in the microlithic tools, but they add the new elements of cattle management and rice cultivation.
And sites like Koldiwa provide the physical proof of this early cultivation.
Koldiwa is famous for its pottery, which had clear impressions of domesticated rice husks embedded right in the clay. While the calibrated dates are still debated a bit, some place this Neolithic phase startlingly early, maybe between the 8th and 6th millennia BCE.
So potentially in the same league as Mehrgar, but with a totally different grain.
Exactly. And Mahagara, a nearby site, offers perhaps the most tangible evidence of early animal control anywhere in the form of the Mahagara cattle pen.
The cattle pen. Tell us about this.
It's a fantastic piece of evidence. It was an irregular, fenced enclosure about 12.5 by 7.5 meters, clearly defined by a surrounding ring of post holes, and it was found right in the middle of the settlement.
But the real insight came from the floor of the pen itself.
Precisely. The excavation revealed just countless overlapping hoof marks of perhaps 40 to 60 different cattle, including juvenile animals. The sheer density and variety of ages confirms this was a dedicated, long-term animal management area, a cattle pen where animals were kept, controlled, and likely bred right inside the settlement.
It's the essence of domestication that moved from wild tracking to controlled penning.
Absolutely. And further east, evidence from Lahuradeva confirms the continued importance of this rice tradition, with people living in wattle and daub houses and cultivating domesticated rice from the late 6th to early 5th millennia BCE.
Okay, let's move to a completely different environmental niche. The Kashmir Valley, where communities adapted to the harsh northern climate by becoming pit dwellers.
The Kashmir Neolithic sites of Burzahum and Gufkral, located on these ancient lake bed terraces called karawas, represent a really unique cultural adaptation, starting around 3000 BCE.
What's the defining architectural feature of Burzahum Period 1?
It's the pits. They're deep, narrow at the top, widening toward the bottom, and often lined with mud plaster. They can reach almost 4 meters deep. Post holes suggest they had conical thatched roofs at ground level.
And the dominant interpretation is that these were winter dwellings.
Right, designed to cope with the severe Kashmir cold by using the earth as insulation.
But the sources noted a controversial counter-hypothesis about what they were for.
That's right. The counter-argument, which often references parallels from the British Iron Age, suggests that these pits might actually have been large, sealed, underground grain storage units.
No, not houses at all.
In this hypothesis, people might have been transhumant, migrating away during the harshest part of winter, leaving their grains sealed underground for the spring. However, the consistent presence of hearths, ash, and occupational debris still leads most scholars to favor the dwelling interpretation.
And regardless of their primary use, the artifacts they made are very distinctive.
The Kashmir Neolithic had a superb bone tool industry, far more developed than what you see in the South. They crafted beautiful, precise tools, needles with eyes for fine stitching, awls, spearheads, harpoons, daggers.
And those unique stone harvesters.
Yes. These rectangular stone choppers or knives perforated with holes on the blunt side, they're really only found at Burzahum and Gufkral.
And the burial practices at Burzahum are perhaps the most evocative.
They really are. In period 2, they started burying humans within the habitation area, sometimes right under the house floors. But the most unique aspect is the burial of humans with animals.
What kind of animals?
They found interments of deer, pig, wolf, snow leopard, and most frequently domesticated dogs. It suggests these animals, especially the dogs, held a significant personal or ceremonial status. They were possibly interred as faithful companions or as sacrificial offerings.
And there's even some rare artistic evidence.
The engraved stone slabs, they're remarkable. One depicts a complex hunting scene, a stag with large antlers being pierced from behind by a hunter. It's just this incredible window into their symbolic world.
Shifting south again, we look at Rajasthan and Malwa, where settled life seems to have bypassed a pure Neolithic phase entirely and went straight into the Chalcolithic, the use of copper.
This suggests a really rapid technological leap, probably fueled by local resource availability and extensive trade. The Ganeshwar Jodhpura culture, centered around the copper-rich zones of Baleshwar and Khetri, is the perfect example of this. Dating back to around 3800 BCE, Ganeshwar was a specialized, almost industrial-scale copper working center.
We're talking massive production. Hundreds of copper objects, fishhooks, arrowheads, spearheads were found there.
The sources suggest Ganeshwar functioned almost exclusively as a source of raw and finished metal for other emerging cultures. Crucially, the evidence indicates they were actively supplying copper objects and metal ores to the early Harappan settlements.
So these specialized, non-urban Chalcolithic cultures were fueling later urbanization.
That's a key economic role they played.
Further south, the Ahar or Banis culture gives us insight into the settled life of Rajasthan.
Ahar, dating to around 2500 BCE, and its related sites like Giland and Balathal, were large agricultural and pastoral communities. Their signature is their pottery, the distinctive black and red ware, usually painted with linear and dotted geometric designs in white pigment.
And Belafol in particular suggests some significant social organization or maybe even military necessity.
The discovery of the fortification wall at Balathal was striking. It was a massive structure, a mud brick wall reinforced with stone rubble over 5 meters wide, and it enclosed a substantial area of the settlement.
The labor needed for that would have been immense.
The sheer scale suggests a high degree of centralized social organization, the ability to mobilize a large workforce, and perhaps a perceived need for defense.
And a potentially controversial note regarding technology from Ahar.
Yes. In the later levels at Ahar, archaeologists found early iron objects, including a ring and a nail. Now, the exact context and dating are still debated because it significantly predates the widely accepted Iron Age in the subcontinent. But it opens up the possibility of much earlier localized iron production than we previously believed.
Finally, let's tackle the Deep South, the Deccan Plateau, where the early Neolithic was dominated by cattle pastoralism and this mystery of the ash mounds.
The Neolithic sites here from about 2900 BCE onwards are often located on top of granite hills, which reflects their focus on grazing lands. And the landscape is dominated by these ash mounds, huge, strange accumulations of calcined and vitrified material.
What was the debate about these mounds initially?
They were really confusing at first. Some thought they were natural volcanic formations. Others suggested they were the remnants of metalworking because of the vitrified, glassy nature of the material. It took seminal research in the 1950s by archaeologists like F.E. Zeuner and Raymond Olchin to confirm what they were.
Which was?
Massive, burnt heaps of accumulated cow dung.
So they were evidence of Neolithic cattle pens.
Exactly. The ash mounds mark locations where large herds of cattle were penned, often within heavy enclosures built of massive wooden posts. The accumulated dung mixed with refuse was repeatedly set on fire.
Why the repeated burning? Was it just for sanitation?
Sanitation and pest control were certainly practical reasons, but scholars like Ulchin argued that it likely served a ritualistic purpose as well. These burnings might have coincided with seasonal festivals or purification rites.
Like what?
Perhaps to protect the herds from disease by driving the cattle through fire or smoke, a practice that has strong ethnographic parallels in pastoral communities even today.
And the site of Booty Hall gives us the most visceral evidence of the social significance of these herds.
Booty Hall in Karnataka not only showed the link between the settlement and the ash mound, but provided definitive evidence of collective feasting. Archaeologists discovered this large, prepared, plastered butchering floor spanning 200 to 250 square meters, located right between the habitation site and the cattle pen.
Which suggests this was a big community event, rather than just daily slaughter.
The sheer size of the floor, coupled with the concentration of material, They found huge quantities of fragmented cattle bones, evidence of large-scale slaughter, alongside chopping tools and chirp blades. And nearby, they found small roasting pits with burnt bones, confirming the cooking process.
So it points to a big ceremonial feast.
The arrangement strongly suggests collective, possibly ceremonial, community feasting. It indicates that the slaughter and consumption of cattle were moments of major social and ritual importance in the Deccan Neolithic.
The regional variation is so complex and fascinating. But we need to synthesize the overarching consequences of this great transition. What was the global trade-off when humankind chose sedentarism and farming over mobility and hunting?
Well, the primary long-term consequence was a shift in mobility. For most groups, it led to increased sedentariness, living in one place for longer. And this created a profound, enduring, and intensive relationship between the community and its immediate environment. It required a massive investment in that particular piece of land.
But the sources make a strong case that this improved lifestyle, this stability, came at a significant cost to physical health.
It did. It's one of the great counterintuitive facts of archaeology. Studies of ancient skeletons confirm that hunter-gatherers, despite what we think of as a struggle, generally had a varied, high-protein, balanced diet,
Fewer cavities.
far fewer cavities, and fewer signs of nutritional stress. Early farmers, conversely, shifted heavily to high-carbohydrate staples, rice, wheat, barley. And this carb-heavy diet led to a measurable decline in dental health, increased vulnerability to infectious diseases which spread easily in denser populations.
And nutritional deficiencies.
Yes, often signs of specific nutritional deficiencies associated with depending on just a few key crops.
We saw that marker of deteriorating dental health, even at Mehrgar. So while individual health might have suffered, the population as a whole boomed. This caused massive demographic shifts.
The demographic advantage of farming is undeniable. The combination of a soft, predictable, high-carb diet and the reduced physical stress of a sedentary lifestyle meant that women had decreased birth intervals.
They could have more children closer together.
Exactly. They could wean infants sooner and carry them more safely, leading to higher overall birth rates.
And a settled life was safer for the most vulnerable members of society.
Absolutely. A highly mobile hunting-gathering lifestyle is physically demanding and dangerous for young children and the elderly. Sedentary life was easier on both ends of the age spectrum, potentially reducing death rates and significantly changing the age profiles within these growing communities.
The transition also required a fundamental cognitive shift. It demanded entirely new planning horizons and changes in the rhythm of daily labor.
The new food ethic was maybe the biggest change. Hunter-gatherers operate on a daily acquisition model. You hunt or gather what you need for today or tomorrow. Farmers had to shift to long-term planning.
Right, you have to plan for the whole year.
You have to produce massive surpluses during a narrow harvest window and successfully store that food for months, sometimes years in advance. And this necessitated whole new toolkits, grinding stones, mortars, pestles, and most importantly, pottery for safe, long-term storage.
And these changes in labor and production inevitably led to new gender roles.
Based on ethnographic parallels and material evidence, scholars argue that women likely spearheaded the initial experiments in plant domestication. In many Mesolithic societies, men primarily hunted while women gathered. It would logically be the gatherers who noticed which plants responded best to selective intervention.
And pottery?
Since pottery was so tied to cooking, processing, and long-term storage, it's very likely women played a significant role in developing the technical skills related to ceramics.
Beyond the practical, this shift to depending on specific crops and herds must have deeply affected their spiritual lives and belief systems.
It created a new spiritual economy centered on fertility. When your entire survival depends on the successful germination of seeds or the fecundity of your herds, concerns about fertility and related magic or rituals just increase exponentially.
This is where those iconic terracotta figurines come in. The females and the humped bulls we see everywhere from Mehrgar to Balathal. They are often very quickly labeled as mother goddesses.
And this is where we have to be really cautious. While it's highly probable that these farming societies developed fertility cults and revered goddesses, we have to neutrally label them as female figurines with likely cultic significance.
Because we just don't know for sure.
As the sources remind us, without direct written context, they could have served many purposes. Educational tools, tokens of status, toys, or just decorative items. Their meaning often resides in how and where they were thrown away.
Finally, the way they treated their dead indicates a profound change in how they viewed the afterlife and their ancestors.
We see a move towards standardized, purposeful burials. The increased use of red ochre, a symbolic pigment associated with life and blood, and the common practice of burying the deceased in a flexed position implies a standardized ritual.
And burying them within the settlement itself seems significant.
Finding these burials within or adjacent to habitation areas, as we saw at Mehrgar and Burzaham, signifies the importance attached to maintaining a physical relationship with the ancestral dead.
And the grave goods reflect that new spiritual framework.
The inclusion of food offerings, tools, ornaments, and even domesticated animals suggests a belief in a continued existence or a journey beyond death, one that required provisions. The variations and standardization of these rituals underscore the development of clear, codified funerary customs across all these diverse regions.
This deep dive has shown, I think pretty definitively, that the transition to food production in the Indian subcontinent was just far from a uniform event. It was a messy, complex, brilliant, and variegated cultural mosaic.
It really was. From the independent barley domesticators of Mehrgar to the rice farmers of the Vindhyas, the specialized pit-dwelling bone workers of Kashmir, and the highly organized cattle pastoralists of the Deccan.
And the key takeaway seems to be the sheer resilience and diversity of that early phase. Between 7,000 and 3,000 BCE, you have communities operating at the same time. Specialized pastoralists, mixed farmers, people still reliant on hunting and fishing.
And all trading and interacting with one another.
We've seen specialized craft centers like Ganeshwar, vast long-distance exchange networks proven at Mehrgar with lapis and turquoise, and immense social organization demonstrated by the massive fortifications at Balathal. These are the deep foundations.
The advent of agriculture did more than just feed people. It created the structural capacity, the stable population base, the specialized labor, the accumulated surplus, and the interconnected trade routes for massive future change.
Which raises our final provocative thought for you to consider. We have witnessed the complexity of these regional cultures, the copper workers, the pearl traders, the unique ceramic producers. Given that these diverse, decentralized early villages coexisted and traded extensively with the much more complex, centralized urban Harappan civilization around 3000 to 2000 BCE, how much did the diverse, decentralized knowledge, the steady flow of raw materials, and the specialized food production capability of these regional farming cultures directly fuel the eventual and dramatic rise of South Asia's first great urban centers?